everyone. Thanks for joining. We're still waiting for a few people to gather, so we're going to introduce ourselves as we do that, and then we'll jump into the presentation. But we want to get started. My name is Graziella Jackson. I'm the User Experience Director for EchoDitto, and I'm joined by Jessica Teal, who's the founder and principal of Teal Media.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you guys for taking the time to join. Today we wanted to talk a little bit about how to plan ahead to 2015 for responsive strategy, mobile responsive. We know that a lot of our clients and nonprofits are moving into 2015 strategy discussions and budget discussions, and we wanted to be able to arm you today with some information and some strategic questions that you can take with you as you move into those planning cycles to prepare you for thinking ahead to 2015. And the reason why we wanted to start today with thinking about mobile was because we know that our world is moving towards a direction where we have rapid mobile adoption, and we'll talk a little bit about statistics behind that today. And really thinking about your web channels and your web programs from a mobile-first perspective so that you can drive your messages and your out to your audiences wherever they are, whenever they are, on whatever device they're accessing the internet with. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. You have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, as we're going along in the presentation, definitely jot down your questions. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. And if you can send your questions to hashtag DigitalPlan2015, then we'll get that and we'll be able to address all of those toward the end of the presentation.
Okay, great. We're going to get started. Okay. Okay, so you should be able to see the presentation. If during the course of this you have any technical difficulties, you can use the same hashtag to let us know. We'll be monitoring it along the way. And again, please feel free to send your questions as we move through the presentation, and we'll make sure we leave enough time to address them at the end. So we wanted to get started with thinking about how we interact across the internet, what screens we're interacting with and bringing into our life on a daily basis over the course of our life cycle as users connecting through the internet at various stages during the day, and start with the kind of guiding principle that we're really, really radically connected. And what that means is that we've got a web that's had this proliferation of content over the past 10 to 15 years. It's filled with contagious ideas that we see on Facebook, that we see on blogs, we see in news media outlets, and really it's an information ecosystem and a content ecosystem that has no way of being controlled or contained. And so as an organization moving forward, looking at how to prioritize digital work, so whether it's websites, it's mobile websites, it's content, it's social media activities, it's email activities, the biggest goal should really be to learn how to spark conversations by figuring out exactly how to connect those ideas that are already out there with your objectives and your brand in a way that gives the power to your users to have conversations, to mold conversations, and then to leverage their networks on your behalf to continue those conversations in a positive direction for you. But because ideas are the domain of our users, to basically do with what as they please, there really is no centralized control of our conversation. So the best thing that we can do for ourselves as we move into strategy is be agents of curiosity, is to really go out there and listen intently, try to understand what's deeply motivating our users in their conversations, and then try to find ways to reach them with what they need in order to continue the conversation, rather than our trying to wrangle them around messaging. And that's a very different approach to content and to communication with our users than we've been used to for the past maybe 10 to 15 years. It's really about putting them at the center of our story and giving them what they need in order to engage with us. And so the challenge for our strategy and how to prioritize the work we do is really prioritizing ways to act and react to our users 24/7, all around the year, throughout all mediums, and then especially mobile, which is the focus of our conversation today. So you have three very important allies in this. The first one is your experience strategy or your experience design. We'll go over that a little bit. The second is your content strategy. And then the third is your actual channel, your effective use of mobile, especially channels, in getting your experience and your content out to your users. So we want to do a quick recap or a quick kind of overview on how to have a good and effective user experience design. And basically, you want to start with insights and best practices driven strategy and architecture that really is designed to satisfy user needs. And the only way to get to an understanding of what your users really want and need is to ask them, either through research, through looking at your Google Analytics, through really monitoring your social media channels, and then through direct user research and usability testing. It's the best way for you to prioritize your resources, your time, your staff, and your budgets around what types of projects to tackle. And insights can also help you justify your priorities when you're talking to boards of directors or influential decision makers within your organization who have ultimate decision-making authority over budget allocation and those sorts of governance-related things. Simple, clear content anchored to a central theme and very rich storytelling designed for persuasion, emotion, and trust. Your content is your king. Your content is the asset that your users are going to interact around, and so you really need to spend time focusing on content. An experience that appeals to all learning styles. This is really important. I think the web has entered a stage where it's very text-based and information-heavy, but only about a third of population learns through textual learning styles. There are auditory learners, tactile, kinesthetic, and so you really have to have an experience that's designed for touch and very multisensory. And then the last is really smart and intuitive interaction design that is easy to use on lots of devices, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. So the next thing that we wanted to go over is content, and we basically have three things to say about content. The first is that content strategy is the new advertising. You really need to leverage content not just to give a sense of how your organization is operating and what your mission is, but really engaging your audiences around stories and proof, things that actually allow them to put themselves at the heart of your story and then really motivates them to share your story with their networks, because that's how you get more deeply engaged audiences. You need to educate them, entertain them, and have them really feel connected with your brand in a very positive way. This phrase, treadmills belong in the gym, not on your web channels. What this speaks to is that for a long time, especially since the dawn of content management systems, we've had access and the ability through technology to push a lot of content out to our users. But what that ends up happening is a lot of pushing of content out that we're not entirely sure is useful to them. And so this is a call to action to shift your thinking away from, hey, we have a website, we have web channels, how can we get users to interact with them, and thinking more about it in terms of we have web channels, how do our users want to interact with us, and really revising your content strategy so you're not pushing content out endlessly that may or may not be meaningful, but you're really reducing your content effort, making it very relevant to your users, and really focusing on pulling users in with content that is highly valuable to them. And the way that you do that is you customize your content to your user goals through research and identifying more of their attributes. You limit the amount and the scope of content and the choices that you're giving your users. Reduce complexity. That's the new sort of mantra for web design, especially with mobile design, is unclutter, declutter your content. Asking users for commitments, small commitments that become larger commitments over time. Users want to be engaged, they want to have a relationship with you, and so making sure that you're baking in opportunities for them to actively engage. Appealing to basic human needs, talking about things that really speak to our well-being as individuals and as community members. Time sensitivity and scarcity, so making sure your content has a sense of urgency, always including storytelling. Human faces and stories are the top performing content, and so always making sure you're story-based, and then leveraging social validation so you can benefit from peer influence and peer engagement to nurture your users even more deeply with your organization and your mission. And so with all of that said, creating, great experience, absolutely winning and striking content that's engaging your users, then you need to get to the how of how you do that. And basically the driving hypothesis with the mobile rate adoption being what it is, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is that if you're not reaching your audiences where they are, you're really just not reaching them. The most web interactions happen when people are between places. They have time to spend because they're in transit, or they're in coffee shops, or they're waiting for meetings. They're bringing the internet with them and using it to fill time that is vacant time in their otherwise busy schedule. And so you really need to make sure that you're accommodating that by having your content and your experiences available not only on small devices but in short bursts of time, so they can get highly relevant and valuable interactions in short spaces of time. So some statistics on mobile. About 30% of global internet traffic to North American websites at the end of last year came from smartphones and tablets. That's up 34% year over year from 2012. So this is really, really a boom in mobile adoption. I'm just going to go through a few of these statistics. 91% of all people on Earth have a mobile phone. If you look at 74% of users will wait 5 seconds for a web page to load. We'll talk about why that is so crucial in your mobile planning, to think about making an experience optimized for mobile and optimized for time reduction. It's really, really important. In 5 seconds in life is short. 5 seconds in internet time is an eternity. And these facts will be available in the recap of this presentation, and we're happy to answer questions about those after the fact if you have any. And so the approach to mobile historically has given two options. An M.dot site or a mobile-only site, you'll see this whenever you visit a media site or YouTube and you see your URL prefaced with an M.dot. That's what we call a mobile-only site. A responsive site is a site that actually takes your existing site that you've created for your desktop web experience, and it rejiggers your content and it rejiggers all of your interactive elements so that it fits on a device, on whatever screen device or side screen device rather, and it changes seamlessly so a user can move from device to device and not get a jarring or abrupt change in the overall experience. So when mobile websites started, M.dot sites, they were one of the first efforts to better cater to mobile users, but they sort of have become dead ends for a number of reasons. The first is because when you create an M.dot site, you actually are creating a separate site that's specifically for a device. So you are maintaining two website experiences, one for the full-size desktop, one for mobile, and you're giving your users an artificial and confusing fork in the road, because if they're switching from devices, they have to be aware of the different URLs in order to access the different experiences. Google prefers a single URL. It's easier for it to index for search, and it'll benefit your SEO. An M.dot site can take up to 2 seconds to redirect, so we were talking a little bit about the 5-second rule. 2 seconds in web time is an eternity, and it's 2 seconds that's taking away from your user's potential engagement with you if they have to then shift to a new site and wait for that site to load. M.dot sites mean you have to develop a redirect strategy for devices. We call this subdomain spaghetti, and what it means is basically you have to have a lot of referring URLs that says if you're visiting this page on the website, or if you click on this page on the website, now take the user to this page on the mobile site, and you have to actively manage that. So it's a lot of management overhead for you guys who are managing websites on the ground within organizations, so it can cause a lot of additional hours there. M.dot URLs are sort of the kiss of death for email and social sharing, because what happens is if you've ever tried to share an M.dot URL, it'll end up directing the person who you send it to a experience that's optimized for the small screen. So even if you're on a desktop, you're going to be seeing content that was designed for a 3.5-inch screen, which can be really difficult then for the person who receives the content. And then also you'll see a drop-off in additional share rates or additional email rates because the experience wasn't great for them on their other device. So you want to eliminate that by using responsive. And then you really want your mobile experience to be as rich as your desktop experience and not what we call the SparkNotes version. mobile M.dot sites usually require a reduced experience and reduced content, which really doesn't give your users access to the full breadth of what's available. So we don't want to limit their experience with you in that way. For responsive, this is the design approach that we recommend. Responsive design means your website anticipates and responds to your user behavior and environment based on the screen size, the platform, and the orientation in what we call automatic magically. But it's not. It's a lot of development work on the back end, which we'll talk about. But this means your user can move from a desktop to a laptop to a tablet to a different type of tablet to a cell phone, and the site will automatically rejigger itself and present itself in an optimized way for each device without the user having to do any extra effort. A responsive site eliminates the need for a different design and development phase for existing and future devices. So you design it once and it learns and adapts to all your devices. You don't have to do multiple versions for multiple devices, which is great. Your content follows the create once, publish everywhere model. If you're familiar with this, it was something that was pioneered by NPR when they were starting to send their content out across mobile and other networks. Basically, you have one repository for your content through your content management system, and then it goes out to all of your devices, so you don't have to cross-publish that anywhere else. Users have access to your full website staged out in a way that's appropriate for the small screen, so there may be some reorganization that happens, there may be some cutting of content that happens as your screen size gets smaller, but for the most part it's an interaction that is in line with what your desktop experience is. And then you don't cannibalize your own SEO rankings by sending your users to another URL. A responsive approach, so your strategy and design may include additional designs to tailor any complex interactions for the small screen to improve the experience. So if you have any big interactive elements, let's say interactive maps or slideshows and things like that on your desktop, sometimes you have to do a custom and unique design to tailor those to the small screen. So anything that really is a complex interaction will need a little bit of work in order to make it appropriate for mobile. Creating a responsive specific content strategy for enhanced readability and to improve the content might mean staging out content a little bit differently, doing what in traditional journalism has been called the reverse pyramid model, where you start with broader content that allows your articles to actually be cut depending on device so that you don't always present users with a very lengthy article if it's not appropriate for the screen size. And so having a content strategy for how to do that is a big part of mobile. And then developing and testing any custom interactions required for an optimal mobile experience. So there may actually be new interactions or new features that you may want to develop specifically for mobile based on what you know and learn about your users over time. So in terms of how to plan ahead for costs, so on average designing and developing a site responsibly is going to cost you about 20 to 25% more than a desktop-only experience. And the reason is what we discussed on the previous slide is allowing for some customization to make sure that on the smallest and most granular screen you still have an experience that's enjoyable, easy to use, simple, intact, and very human and very cool for your users. And so you want to do a little bit of strategy to really evaluate what the barriers might be and bake into your design phase strategies to reducing those barriers for your users on the smallest device. And then including responsive design in web planning, again, will just help you reach your audiences whenever, wherever, and doesn't limit them to a certain, to a certain type of device or a certain type of setting to be able to fully engage with you. We're going to go into some design principles. Jessica's going to take over, and she's going to walk us through some best practices and also things that we've learned in executing responsive projects for clients so that we can arm you with some of the best practices of how to approach this from a design perspective.
Sure. So with more and more people accessing the web via mobile and other smaller devices, organizations and designers in particular are becoming more mindful of how their websites are being viewed on mobile. There's been a paradigm shift in the overall approach to design that is focused on simplicity and efficiency, which of course has been primarily influenced by mobile. So let's dive into a few of those trends right now. Number one, you've probably seen this everywhere. Long scrolling pages. They literally are everywhere when people are doing a redesign for their website. And honestly, I don't think they're going away anytime soon because they are actually perfectly suited for the mobile experience. Let's take a look at an example on the next slide here. So here's a sample of the World Food Program USA design. You can access it on your browser at wfpusa.org. So the right side of this slide shows the length of the full home page zoomed out, and the right side shows just a screenshot of the top. So you can kind of get a sense of how long the page really is. It's the slide on the left side is probably only about the top 1,000 pixels of the home page design. And then let's go to the next slide, which shows it in the mobile view. So as you can see, the first unit there is the top page, the second unit is the middle, and then the third section is more of the bottom of that page. So you can see it's quite a long scrolling page on a mobile device. So why this overall long scrolling page approach? Well, first of all, users are very comfortable with scrolling on mobile devices. Think about your own behavior on a mobile phone. You wait a couple seconds for the phone to load, or the page to load on the phone, and then you immediately start scrolling. In order to make things legible on these small screens, the fonts need to be bigger. There's more luxurious use of white space or just regular space in general. Images are bigger for more impact. The content is stacked versus it being in a multi-column layout. And all of that together needs more room. Hence, the pages become longer and there's more scrolling. So let's dive into one of the trends that I alluded to in the previous slide, large typography. Taking a look at an example here. To ensure that users don't have to squint or zoom in to actually read the text on mobile devices, the default font size for body copy has gotten even larger. Specifically, standards now dictate that the standard body copy size should be around 16 pixels. It used to be around 12 pixels just a couple of years ago. And that makes things like subheaders and headers even larger. And of course, this approach for mobile has carried through to desktop design. Another trend that we're seeing is large full-width photos or videos or infographics in that hero area. In order to make a strong immediate emotional impact, large hero images or videos or graphics or whatever you have in that space have become the trend. This is because users have minimal attention span on mobile devices, and we have to deliver the core message as quickly and as impactfully as possible. And since images speak louder than words, we do this with bold imagery right at the top of the page to immediately captivate the user.
And one thing to add there too, you'll see a lot of these sites removing the carousel, which was very popular for a long time. But we have a lot of statistics from our own research and then just the industry in general that have shown that only about 80% of your users interact with the first panel of your carousel. About 1% of people will click through a carousel to the page that links to, and only about 1% of your users will go to any slide on your carousel beyond the first one. And so it's really thinking about what is going to be the biggest impact for your users, what's going to make them feel emotional, what's going to make them feel connected, and it's really simplifying your content and having it focus on one really meaningful thing versus 5 options that may or may not even be seen by your users.
So here's kind of such an example of that. This is a site for Empower Children Through Education, and this is the desktop version of it. Obviously, you can see how it was inspired by mobile because the text is very limited and the homepage is really just focused on delivering a max of 5 key messages. And as Graziella mentioned, just please note the lack of a slider or a carousel. The user isn't going to wait for images to auto-rotate or manually swipe to see what is featured on a mobile device. So that information should just be front and center right away. Of course, this requires very careful editorial planning as part of that content management. Another trend is a more integrated sidebar. As you may have noticed, there are fewer and fewer modern websites that have that traditional right sidebar that promotes various interior sections and actions on the site. And this has evolved for a reason. As we saw in the previous mobile comps, there isn't a lot of room for a sidebar anymore. Content is usually stacked on mobile. And because we need to communicate our messages more succinctly and simply, we need to use our real estate wisely. We can't just willy-nilly decide to promote random things in the sidebar that don't lead to high conversion rates anymore. We need to be strategic about how we incorporate that sidebar contextually and make it relevant to the user. It shouldn't just become a dumping ground for just because content. Another trend we're seeing is flat, solid design. And if you go to the next slide, you may have noticed a lot of designs looking like this. They're bold, they're flat looking, there's a flat use of color, very simple geometric shapes and large blocks. If you are a PC person, think the Windows 8 design. There's no more or there's fewer things like gradients, heavy drop shadows, and filter effects. And this is because flat, solid geometric design can be easily and quickly rendered via HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, unlike heavy-duty image-laden designs. And if the majority of your design can be generated via code rather than images, the more lightweight and faster loading site you have. And since we saw that users on mobiles won't want to wait more than a few seconds for a page to load, it's ever more important that your site load quickly. And finally, mobile-specific navigation. This is the ultimate example of the overall design approach being influenced by mobile. Take a look at this site from Squarespace. This is the desktop design. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner the word menu with 3 little horizontal lines, which is often referred to as the hamburger icon. It's something that you're probably used to seeing on mobile. And note the lack of a traditional navigation bar or a horizontal list of main navigation items. Instead, all the site navigation is actually tucked away in this little menu icon on the desktop site, just like on the mobile experience. If you go to the next slide, you can see what it looks like when it's expanded. Some may say this is mobile design gone too far, and I honestly might tend to agree. At Echo Ditto and Teal, we usually recommend designing according for what's best for the experience on the device, not designing for the device itself. But I wanted to share this trend as some of the leading organizations and companies are experimenting with this. So now that we've seen some trends in the design, what are some best practices that are emerging? As a designer, I can't help but say this, but the fold is dead, people! The fold is dead. Remember that imaginary horizontal line about 700 pixels down the page or so? A lot of people are obsessed with it. Well, we no longer need to be so obsessed with it. Well, why? Where is the fold? What fold are you talking about? The one on my laptop, the one on my computer, my iPhone, my iPad? It's totally variable for the device. But how do we really know that the fold is dead? Well, here's some basic research from a firm called CSX Partners, a usability testing firm. They conducted a number of user testing sessions, 800 in fact, and in only 3 sessions did the page fold prove to be a barrier to getting the content. Of course, this requires careful content planning. Secondly, when they did some eye tracking data research, they noticed a strong heat spot on the scroll bar. So people are recognizing scroll bars on a browser to indicate that more content lies below, and the browser also gives a visual indication of how long the page is by where the little cursor is in that scrolling rail. And then they also evaluated some click data, and it does support that people do scroll. There was a researcher from AOL who actually took a look at TMZ, the entertainment news publication, if you can call it a news publication, website data, and they have super long pages, and they often found that some of the most clicked on elements were actually at the bottom of the page. So if that content is compelling, of course, you have to make sure to plan your content appropriately and not have any wasted content in between or at the bottom of the page. And research shows that often less content above the fold actually encourages users to scroll and explore underneath. Here's some heat map data about that. You can see in the first example where content is sort of crammed in there that people just sort of stop at a given point. But if you look at that next screenshot with a larger hero and a larger promotion area on that page, people actually decided to scroll with the site.
And a lot of this has been influenced by interaction users have with sites like Pinterest, where you do continually scroll and you do find highly valuable and relevant content. And so when we think about our users coming to our sites, they're bringing with them a whole host of assumptions and behaviors that they're learning on the most cutting-edge sites, and we can actually benefit from them experiencing those sites and changing the way that they interact with our sites just by virtue of having those experiences.
And some other best practices in designing for touch are, of course, as mentioned before, generate as much of the design as possible using code for faster load times. Forget about hovering and tooltips. They won't work on mobile, obviously. And avoid modal windows and light boxes. They won't work on mobile either, or they'll be really annoying, and users will become frustrated and won't know how to click out of it. Other things, as I mentioned before, aim for about 16 pixel body type minimum. Button sizes, just because of the size of your thumb, should be at least 45 to 57 pixels tall and wide. Allow ample breathing room between elements. People are clumsy with their thumbs, so just make sure that there's enough space between elements so they can target their click. Sorry lefties, but since the majority of users are right-handed, aim to place that menu icon, that little hamburger icon in the upper right. As you can see, if you pretend to hold your phone right now and you move your thumb up, it's a lot easier to reach up on that right side versus crossing over your entire phone. Let's move to the left. And the menu is one of the most used navigation elements on a site. And then specifically when it comes to forms, people, because of their low attention span, as well as just the frustration in entering information on a mobile device, you need to keep your form inputs to a minimum. And of course, you need to ensure that the form elements like text fields, drop-down menus, etc., are large enough to interact with, and keep opposing actions away from each other, like cancel and submit buttons. Otherwise, one of them might accidentally get pressed, and then they'll have to refill out the entire form, which is extremely frustrating. And you want to position labels, those little lines of text, above a form element, above the actual element, because if you place it below a drop-down, the drop-down menu could cover that element, etc., and that becomes very frustrating to use.
Okay, so next we're just going to talk about some initial steps to take so that we can allow enough time for some questions. But basically, where to start. So you're going into planning, you're evaluating, where you need to go with this. You want to prioritize responsive. You want to make sure you have a robust content program and a great user experience. So how do we start? Well, the way that we approach this is we always start with a research and evaluation phase across all channels. So we look at the current experience, desktop and mobile. We look at the experience of it, the content of it, the interaction design. We spend a little bit of time looking at what might be out there that's comparative in either your space or top-of-class sites and experiences that are out there, and we bring that all together into an evaluation and analysis of at least what is happening on the ground today, with kind of a decision on how well and how effectively we think that is, and where it fits in terms of the comparative experience as compared to some of the other experiences that our users may be engaging with on an everyday basis. So we're trying to be very, very, very critical almost of our own experience and really looking for what barriers we may be introducing to users based on what's out there today. And then after we've done that evaluation of our own experience and our own ecosystem, then we really look at our analytics to understand our user behavior. We like to recommend user research and usability testing, again, so we can drive to exactly what our users want, exactly how they like to interact on our sites, And that really gives us real user insights. A part of that activity not only is evaluating your experience and your technology and your implementation of your experience across your technology, but also what are users thinking about our brand? How well are we conveying our message? Are we articulating it in a way that is very simple and very succinct and that is repeated and reinforced and reimagined through all of our channel outreach and all of our communications so that our users are getting a very clear and concise understanding of who we are, the value of our work to them, the value of our work in general, and then the opportunities that they have for engagement. So making sure that that pathway for our users very clearly articulated through our content. And then moving into your 2015 planning cycles is really prioritizing responsive design as a key objective and deciding whether or not your responsive design is really about just taking a look at what exists today and then making sure that it is developed in a way that is responsive for mobile, or whether you need to back up and really address content gaps and experience gaps, really figuring out whether or not you need a more thorough understanding of your users so that you can have a more insights-driven experience that really is focused on driving conversion and increasing your engagement with your audiences. So different organizations are at different stages in that cycle, are at different levels of sophistication with their existing experience, and so some may need to start at strategy and may need to do all of that research and discovery work, and some may have a relatively well positioned brand, well-articulated experience, and can start diving in with the tactics of how to execute that on mobile. So it varies. It varies per organization. So I think that's actually all we have for our presentation. So we have received a few questions. Please, again, send them to #DigitalPlan2015, and we'll just dive in with the questions that we've received.
Sure. So one of our first questions, I think this is a good one for you, Graciela. If we already have a relatively modern looking and behaving site, but it's not responsive, where do we start? How do you go about turning a regular site into a responsive one?
Yeah, that's a good question. It speaks to planning and strategy to me. And I think it is basically the last point that I made. It's really understanding whether your design is layered on top of really effective content and interactions, or whether your design is a really strong design that's layered on top of relatively inadequate or not highly functioning content. So the first thing that I would do would be to really look at, again, your user definitions, how your brand is being expressed, and then making a decision after evaluation of whether or not your content is actually good enough. If the answer to that question is no, then I think that becomes really devising a content strategy that is mapped to your business goals and your user goals. And what you'll find a lot of times in organizations is that content tends to be very, very, very closely aligned to business goals, especially in institutions that may be relatively siloed. But a lot of times content really fails on meeting user goals because it's much more heavily skewed towards being oriented towards the business. That's very natural, and it's something that started when there was the dawn of a content management system, because organizations on the ground are very project-based and results-driven around those projects. And so a lot of the content that goes out through your channels is mapped directly to projects that are being executed on the ground, whether they be nonprofit programs, field work, legislative work. They're very project-centric. But what happens is users actually exist in their relationship with our organizations well beyond individual projects. And so when we provide content in small bursts of project-based messaging, we fragment the experience for our users who really are looking to establish a long-term relationship with us over time. We always joke and say we're not dating, we're looking to get married, and that's kind of the way that it is. But if all of your content is structured in a way that it feels a little bit like you're courting, but with no long-term engagement goals, then your users are going to quickly see through a really great design, and they're going to stop interacting with you, and they're not going to convert. In content strategy, there's been a lot of studies done on sites that had relatively simplistic or very, very bare bones visual design. And if the content was really good, the design did not influence a negative interaction for the user. However, if on the opposite, on sites that had very, very flashy designs and bad content, we found that bad content can significantly have a negative impact on the user experience. So content is actually more of a driver on satisfaction and conversion than the actual visual design is. What visual design does really well is make it simple, is remove barriers, is make it cool and refreshing and differentiate you from other people in the space, and gives a very emotional quality to the interaction that helps to symbolically tell your users what your brand is and what value it has to them. So design really amps up the emotional quality, but you have to have the core content there in place. So that would be the first way to start. And then if you have your content strategy in place that's meeting your business goals and your user goals, and you have a relatively solid experience for desktop that goes down to probably tablet, then you want to take a look at that experience and really come up with some solution strategies, some priorities for what you need to tackle first from a mobile perspective. And it's probably going to align to what Jessica talked about in terms of trends and best practices. So making sure you have a great navigation, addressing how to present sidebar content or contextual content so it's not a barrier, maybe cutting down on content length as we're shrinking to different sizes, making sure that you're increasing the size of your buttons and your links and spacing out your design so it's designed for touch. So those best practices can drive how to prioritize the improvements you make on your existing experience.
Great. So I'm going to answer a design question that came in. Our organization doesn't have high-res images. What's the best use of a hero for us? Does it mean we should use stock photography? I would say stock photography is definitely an option. There are some services like iStockPhoto and ThinkStock where you can get decent-sized images for under $20 a pop. Of course, the hesitation in using stock photography is that other people might be using it too, and of course there's always the threat of, oh, does it look too fake and inauthentic because it is a stock image. If you kind of want to avoid the whole stock photography route, I would encourage you to think about an infographic probably in that hero space, something that presents some great data or a call to action in that space to really drive people to conversion. That would be an additional option for you. You could also just see if there's a way of promoting like a blog post or another piece of featured content and having more of a static background image or graphical treatment, and letting your content take center stage in that area and focus on more of a typography-focused design approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the best way to understand what's going to work best and how to prioritize content is, again, just going back to your users. They will tell you loud and clear what's the most useful content to put in that area, whether it's a conversion path or it's based on analytics and what you've learned about their behavior, or it's messaging that's going out on your email channels. It goes back to that repeat, reinforce, reimagine. You want to think about all of your communications out via direct mail, via TV, if you've got TV advertising programs, via earned, paid, owned media channels, so that you're consolidating messages. And then I think also from a content perspective is really focusing on high quality copywriting, and copywriting in the sense of branded copywriting, not just content production or editorial production. Copywriting is a very specific art form. We kind of call it an art and a science because it's grounded some in the art of writing and some in the science of psychology. And for the most part, organizations have writing capabilities on the ground for a variety of reasons, for editorial, for public relations, for publications, but not all have very sophisticated branded copywriting, and it's something to really prioritize because small, short-form, powerful messages can be some of the most effective ways to engage people.
So that's kind of a good transition into another question that came in. Does adding read time, I'm assuming that's mean like this article will take 1 minute to read, before blog posts and articles have a meaningful impact? I see it a lot when I'm on my phone.
Yeah. So this is a very astute observation, and it's definitely a trend we see on sites like Quora. a lot of the media sites are adding. Yeah, it's an expectation setting and management function for users that users like, and it came out of a lot of readability studies that were done through Human Factors Institute, a number of other usability research firms like CX Partners. And the reason for that is the same convention that we use when we're publishing videos or we're watching videos on Hulu or on YouTube. It gives a user a sense of what time commitment is going to be required to interact with that piece of content, and then allows them to determine how they want to manage their time or their ability to return to that if they will not have enough time to engage with it. Whether it's through social sharing or bookmarking or emailing themselves links, it provides them with a way back, an easy pathway back to that content if they're not going to be able to provide that commitment. And there's lots of ways that you can get to that reading time. There's a formula that's relatively useful for that. You want to gauge, and I think Word has a tool that you can use. The name is escaping me. You want to gauge your writing and make sure you're writing at a relatively 8th grade reading level. And that's not because our audiences aren't sophisticated. It's because the mechanics of reading on screen are really difficult. An 8th grade reading level is the average reading level for someone for enhanced readability view when you're interacting with text on screen. And then you can basically gauge for about 250 words that it's going to be about a minute of reading time. The more sophisticated your language gets, the longer it takes to read. And so you can kind of start to do some testing internally of how much time you think things are going to take to read, have different people with different reading backgrounds read it and take an average of those times. But it's relatively easy to get to adding that reading time, and it can be really, really helpful for your users in having a more effective and more rewarding content experience because you're setting their expectations up front. Reading time isn't the only way to signal. There are lots of other visual cues that you can add. You can add scrolling indicators to show users where they are within the content on the page. You'll see a lot of websites are introducing what we call sticky navigation so that the navigation always stays exposed even if you're scrolling. Sometimes the sticky navigation is leveraged to also give a visual signal as to how far you are in a piece of content. So all of those work together to basically reduce the effort on the user to figuring out what the interaction with that piece of content is going to be like. It's a less of a heavy burden on the users when we give them more indicators for how they can manage their own experience.
And then the final question that came in was, how many breakpoints do you recommend? Do you target multiple font sizes or just a common middle ground?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm actually not a front-end developer, and if you ask 12 front-end developers, they'll probably give you slightly different answers, but basically the way we scale it is for desktop, is for tablet. Usually a 7-inch variation might be derived from the tablet, but may need some rejiggering of elements, and then a 3.5-inch screen or the smallest, most granular mobile device. So I would say, depending on what you find out about your users and what you learn from analytics are their primary devices that they're using, you can probably go with a 2 or 3 breakpoint strategy.
Yeah, and I find that out a lot with our Teal Media clients. You know, baseline, we're starting at 3, the desktop, tablet, and mobile breakpoint, and then digging into analytics if we find something that sort of just makes us decide that we need an in-between size. It also is kind of dependent on the design itself. If you notice that it starts breaking at one of the in-between sizes and would prove to be a really poor experience, you might want to consider spending a little bit more time on that in-between size so the design doesn't break and you can make sure that those users are having a great experience as well. So that was it. Those are all the questions that came in. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yep, thank you. And please, if you have any other questions, let us know. We will be sending this out after the fact, and we're always here at EchoDitto to answer any questions you may have, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much for joining us.